Welcome to session number 21 of an introduction to biblical prophecy. We finished up last time around, back in December, we finished up the concept of the day of the Lord as it's developed in both the Old and New Testament, in combination with the outline of Daniel and some of the other prophets. It's clear that the time of the Gentiles and the 70 weeks of Israel come down to a climactic judgment and blessing period that we call the day of the Lord. The passage that we're going to look at this evening is Matthew 24, what we call the Olivet Discourse. They call it Olivet Discourse because it happens on the Mount of Olives. I've forgotten who gave it that name, but it's been around a long time. The Olivet Discourse happens in all three of the synoptic Gospels. So you will find this in Matthew, Mark, and Luke in slightly different versions. No contradictions between those versions, but there are slightly different versions. I'm going to include a little bit from all of them, but we'll build it around the Matthew 24 passage. Let me get that share screen up. Yeah, see, we can do this. Oops. Here it comes. Bingo. Okay, this is the view from about halfway up the Mount of Olives. We don't know where the disciples stopped on the Mount of Olives, but they were walking away, probably came out the eastern gate. And if you can see the dome of the rock there, look off to the right on the other edge of the page. Along that wall, you see a bricked up gate. That's the eastern gate. And in Jesus' time, that gate led up onto the temple platform, about 100 meters north of the present location of the Dome of the Rock. That was the original location of the temple. And both the first and the second temple were built there. And there's good reason to believe that the later so-called tribulation temple will be built in the same general area alongside of the Dome of the Rock. Anyway, this is the view. Walking up from Jerusalem is a wonderful way to get a view of the Temple Mount, and for that matter, all of Jerusalem. This particular shot was taken, oh my goodness, many, many years ago, just after dawn. I was with a group of men, and we walked from our hotel rooms in the YMCA all the way across the old city of Jerusalem and up onto the Mount of Olives to catch the dawn. And it's a great place to just sit and contemplate for a while. Lots of details here that I'm not going to go into quite yet, but this is the geographic context of the conversation that's going to happen here in Matthew 24 and on into 25. Some introductory notes. First of all, because of what we know from other places and just the details of what we have here specifically, it's clear that the Olivet Discourse is about the future of Israel, not the church, except in the most general sense. The church is not the focus of the Olivet Discourse. It's Jesus' disciples who are Jewish are asking about his return and the initiation of the kingdom. And they were concerned about the destruction of the temple. Of course, he predicts that. And then they ask, well, when will you return and when will the kingdom be established? These are Old Testament predictions. The Messiah coming a second time to set up the kingdom is, of course, a big deal. And that's what the prophets look forward to, both the first and second comings of Christ. The disciples were still not clear about the amount of time between the first coming and the second coming. They just didn't know. Let me see here if I can show. Yeah, well, we'll see. Um, so this is for Israel. It's not specifically for the church, although, of course, we're allowed to read it. All three of the synoptic gospels contain the Olivet Discourse, uh, with some specific differences between them. There are intersections with both Daniel and the book of Revelation. And this gives us very clear pointers as to the timing. The Olivet Discourse uh, refers briefly to the fall of Jerusalem that happened in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed the city and destroyed the temple. The majority of the Olivet Discourse refers to the very end of history, what we call the 70th week of Daniel. Daniel clearly predicts a 70th week measured from the rebuilding of the decree to rebuild the wall in Jerusalem, 445 BC, down to the end of the 69th week, which is what Jesus was living as he uh, preaches this sermon, uh, leading up to the crucifixion and the resurrection. History did not end 7 years later. There is an obvious gap between the end of the 69th week and the beginning of the 70th week. And it is not clear now, nor was it clear to the disciples, how big a gap there would be between the resurrection and the second coming, or between the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 and the end of the time of the Gentiles, the 70th week, in prophetic literature. We just didn't know. The fall of Jerusalem does not fulfill the Olivet Discourse then. It's one of the steps along the way that must happen. But the majority of this passage refers to the end of history. And as a side note, the so-called rapture is not found in Matthew 24 or in either of the other Gospels. This is an Israel passage, not specifically a church passage. We find the rapture fully developed only by Paul. We actually don't see it specifically in the book of Revelation. Paul develops it clearly, and we really ought to believe in the rapture of the church because of that. But we shouldn't expect to find it in places where it's not going to belong. And here it doesn't belong. Unless we go into this passage assuming that Israel has been replaced by the church. In the Reformed tradition, expositors teach that Israel is no longer a factor in the world. There is no Israel in the biblical sense. The church is the new Israel and is the only Israel that matters. And therefore, conservatives in the Reformed tradition teach that if there is going to be a rapture, it will happen at the end of the 70th week, not at the beginning. Paul speaks of a rapture at the beginning of the 70th week. But if you build an eschatology of the church on Matthew 24, you'll find some hints that perhaps the church is the people group suffering during the tribulation period, and that the church is the group gathered at the end of the tribulation period. I take Matthew 24 in the larger context of the whole of biblical prophecy, and on that level, I can't see the church in this passage. I can see how the Reformed expositors can find it, but really you have to come in with a presupposition that Jesus is talking to the church and not to Israel. Otherwise, it's just not there. If you make a distinction between Israel and the church and the plan of God, then it's very easy to understand Matthew 24. Otherwise, not so much. Okay, let's actually begin at the end of chapter 23, and we'll start with some of this. You notice that there's a Jerusalem centrism to the Olivet Discourse, obviously. By the way, this photograph was taken a different year from a different location and a different time of day. So it's not the same thing at all, but there it is. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing? So the message here is a message of woe to Jerusalem because of her disobedience and her obstinance. She kills the prophets and stones those who are sent. And this is a story with many of the Old Testament prophets. They died martyrs' deaths. There's a Jewish book called The Lives of the Prophets that details the traditions of how all of the prophets died, and it's not a pretty picture. And yet Jesus says, how often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood? But you were not willing. The unwillingness of Israel to be loved by God is a continuing problem, and it's a continuing theme in both the Old Testament prophets and in the New Testament. So Jerusalem is the center. This is the setting. This is the topic of the discussion. And so there's some interesting stuff that's going to happen here. Behold, your house is left to you desolate. I'm telling you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. With Israel in the center, Jerusalem in the center, the house is the temple. Let's see. Okay. The house is that temple. It's going to be knocked down, and there'll be nothing left to see, but some indentations in the stone, which is what we have here up on the Temple Mount itself. The basic thrust of this Olivet Discourse is then obviously the future of Israel, particularly Jerusalem. Jerusalem is always going to be the core of biblical prophetic events. We really don't see all kinds of other places. There's no mentions of Rome or New York or Manila or big cities around the world, but Jerusalem keeps coming up. And the reason for that is not that God doesn't care about the rest of the world. He obviously does. But rather that in prophecy, in the structure of this future story that God is telling, Israel is at the center and always will be. The house, of course, is the temple, and it will not be rebuilt until the end time. If you go to Jerusalem today, you'll find nothing but, well, you won't even find the ruins. The ruins have mostly been covered up by the pavement that the Muslims put up on the Temple Mount in order to cover the old ruins and to build a foundation for their Dome of the Rock. This happened in the late 600s AD. So that Dome of the Rock has been there for a good long time. A lot of the materials for building the Dome of the Rock came from the destruction of churches that were in Jerusalem at that time, particularly a really, really big church called the Nea, or the New Church. And this one had beautiful marble columns and all kinds of very nice materials that were reused for the construction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. Particularly in the Dome of the Rock, we can see these displayed. They're just everywhere. The time of the Gentiles theme that we find in Luke 21 in the same Olivet Discourse predicts that the Gentiles will trample the Temple Mount until the end of the 70th week, till what we call the tribulation period. So the message of this whole passage is for the disciples as Israel, and not for the disciples as the church, although they intersect. Jesus' disciples were, in fact, the core of the church, but they were also the last representatives of the righteous remnant of Israel. And so there is this crossover that is important to keep straight in our minds. Okay, so what is he doing? At the beginning of chapter 24 of Matthew, first couple of verses here, Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. And it would have been spectacular. It is spectacular today. The panorama of Jerusalem is one of the more magnificent views in the whole world. Of any place that is a city. It's spectacular. It's as good as the view of the Roman Forum from, say, Paul's prison church, or the view of I'm thinking of other places that are really spectacular. There are a few spectacular views in the world. The view of Paris with the Eiffel Tower and the Seine River going through, and the Notre Dame Cathedral. Oh, and I can't remember the place I was standing where I saw all of that, but Paris is pretty. Any of you who've been to Florence will probably remember I think it's the Michelangelo Overlook, and see the whole city of Florence. Jerusalem is that kind of spectacular. And his disciples came to this specific point where you could see the panorama of the walls of Jerusalem and all of the buildings of the temple and the city itself spread out. And he answered them, "You see all of these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Okay. So the passage starts out with this locator. We've got Jesus sitting on the Mount of Olives. Okay, and he's going to say that again in the next verse. And the disciples have been walking with Jesus about half a mile, maybe 10 minutes. And the whole time, the panorama of the temple was becoming more and more prominent and impressive. So it's unreasonable to think that the context has changed from the previous conversation. The temple is still the primary subject. So in verse 3, he, uh, he was sitting there and teaching them, and they're looking out here at the Temple Mount, and the disciples came to him privately with and there would have been a group of Christians or a group of believers, disciples, Jewish uh, hangers on who were with him, but the disciples came to him and said, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Okay, so they're asking actually two separate questions. One, when will these things be, is asking about the destruction of the temple. That has to be, that's what Jesus has just been predicting. He said this Temple Mount that you're looking at is going to be destroyed. The temple itself will be knocked down, not one stone on another. And that actually came to pass 40 years later in 70 AD under the Roman General Titus and a mixed band of Roman soldiers, mostly Syrian in background. The Romans didn't send actual Italians on most of their foreign adventures. They, for the most part, the Romans used local mercenary troops. In Titus' 10th Legion, that did the destruction of Jerusalem, there were groups from Egypt, there were groups from Syria, which includes a fairly broad range, and some from farther north into the area that we call Turkey. Most of these were people who, one, spoke Arabic of a sort, and two, were part of the ancient hatred of the Jews. Tacitus, as I recall, tells us that the soldiers who destroyed the temple in Jerusalem were Syrian and Egyptian Arab speakers who hated the Jews with the hatred of close neighbors. So these are part of the surrounding countryside. And this fits with everything else that we know about how the Romans operated. Josephus tells us that the temple was destroyed in spite of Titus' willingness to save it. The Syrian soldiers, Syrian Roman soldiers, set fire to the temple, and the word came to Titus, and he told them to quickly put it out, make that stop. But the soldiers disobeyed and continued burning the temple. So when will these things be? Jesus doesn't actually give an answer to that. He doesn't tell them that it will be 40 years. He leaves them to wonder. The follow-up question that they ask, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? The disciples at this point probably believed that the destruction of the temple would be a part of the events that would happen at the end of the age. Today, we know that that's not true. When we look at the details of the final 7-year tribulation period and compare that to the fall of Jerusalem, we find virtually no similarities. Bad things happen, wars happen, evil people do bad things, but history didn't come to an abrupt conclusion. The Old Testament tells us that 70th week in which Israel will be judged will be followed by the second coming of the Messiah and the beginning of the 1,000-year millennial kingdom. And that's what they're looking for. The sign of your coming. They expect that from the Old Testament. The end of the age. That is a final judgment on the unbelieving world and the beginning of the kingdom age. That's what they're expecting. And the very early church, I believe, had a widely held the position that the second coming and the beginning of the kingdom would be right away, with no interfering history. This is one of the reasons that by about 400 AD, it was fairly common amongst the scholars of the church, the so-called fathers like Augustine, to believe that the church was in fact the kingdom of God. And this was primarily a lack of knowledge of Old Testament prophecy. They were building primarily on New Testament prophecy, the idea that the resurrection happened, and there was a period of destruction of Jerusalem and persecution of the church, and at that point the kingdom began, and the kingdom will begin to fill up the whole world. So the kingdom is this spiritual thing that has no literal significance. The disciples here, though, are taking everything literally, as the Old Testament would demand. When will all this happen? What's the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So Jesus doesn't really give them a lot of clues about the destruction of Jerusalem, although he does say some things in this chapter that could be partly fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem. The disciples believed the kingdom would arrive soon. Jesus doesn't encourage that. They believe that Jesus would set up the eternal kingdom, perhaps as a response to the destruction of the temple. And in fact, that didn't happen. It's what we see in the church age simply doesn't fulfill Old Testament prophecy. And so we go on. And Jesus answered them. And this is interesting. Why would he answer quite like this? As he says, see that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. Okay, he begins with the prediction that there will be false prophets of various kinds. Many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. These are false Christs, not to be confused with the Antichrist. That's a modern term. We've talked about that before. The Antichrist is the man of sin that Paul speaks of, or the willful king of the book of Daniel. And in this case, Jesus is not talking about the Antichrist. He's talking about false Christs, false messiahs. There will be those who claim to be powerful religious leaders, but don't listen to them. They will lead many astray. I believe there have always been false Christs in the church from the very beginning. some have argued that there will be an acceleration of that sort of thing near the end, and I'm not sure I see that. Jesus is saying there's going to be a period of time coming where it will be easy to be led astray. Don't be. And the way we can avoid being led astray is simply to pay attention to what potential leaders are actually saying. Karl Marx, for example, was Jewish. He was an apostate Jew, and he claimed to be the sort of leader that everyone ought to follow into a utopian, brave new world of communism. Uh, and that would be a bad direction for the Jewish people to go. And yet, interestingly, when the Jews came out of Eastern Europe in the years near the end of the 19th century and of course, obviously into the 20th century, they were fleeing the sort of people who were building Marxism. They were fleeing the Bolsheviks and the other precursors to the communists of Russia and Eastern Europe. So Karl Marx, yeah, he's a false messiah, and there's so many others, philosophers and professors and politicians trying to lead us all to the promised land, and it's always some other direction. Many will come saying, "I'm the Christ." Many will be led astray. And the cure for this is a careful study of the Scripture. Always start with the Bible. Stay in the Bible, interpret literally, and that will give you an inoculation, a vaccine against the false Christs. Okay, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. Okay, these photographs obviously taken in very recent days. Here, this is the war of Israel in the Gaza Strip. And these particular Merkava tanks are waiting for the jump off into Gaza Strip. And you can see the smoke rising in the distance. Not a good thing, but not necessarily the end of time. It's interesting. People want to say, oh, well, there's terrible wars in the 20th century. This must be the tribulation period. Well, turns out it wasn't. The tribulation period will last 7 years. There are specific wars that may all be the same war that are mentioned in Scripture that take place during that time. They're going to be quite bad. It's quite likely that Gog and Magog, Armageddon, the Battle of the Three Kings, and the battle that Zechariah predicts are all the same war or episodes of the same war. And these all revolve around the nations surrounding Israel, attacking Israel with the intention of the destruction of the Jewish people. So when we see things like the Iranians arming the militias of Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, and Boko Haram, and the rest, when we see the alignment of nations, as at the United Nations, voting against the interests of the nation of Israel, modern nation of Israel, these are foreshadowings of what will come. You're going to hear of wars and the rumors of wars. Is this the end? Well, not yet. Don't be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. The end time will apparently be an era of wars, not only in Israel, but worldwide. This photograph was taken in the Ukraine, and there's just one more war going on. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Daniel makes a distinction between the first 3.5 years of the tribulation period and the second 3.5 years. John in the book of Revelation makes this distinction. Jesus also makes a distinction between the beginning of birth pains and the great tribulation, the day of Jacob's trouble. What are we in today? Frankly, I don't know. I think we're in the in part of the run-up. We're probably in the wars and rumors of wars period that is a little indefinable. I don't think this is the tribulation period itself. It's going to get worse. But these are the beginnings. You know it's coming. And perhaps soon, perhaps farther off. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. The end time and the years leading up to the end time will be a period of apostasy. This is specifically aimed at the Jewish people. But I believe there are worldwide consequences of this apostasy. This particular character is an Anglican priest, and he is a man pretending to be a woman. And he's widely acclaimed by left-wing Anglicans as the first of a new breed. All the wonders of the transgendered priesthood. This apostasy is a part of the end time. It will affect and infect all of culture, including the church. We're going to find in at least what we could call the professing church a tendency towards all kinds of apostate viewpoints. You'll find the church supporting the homosexual unions. You'll find the church supporting abortion on demand, all kinds of evil things that we know are not biblical and are not based on a knowledge of the truth. This will be common, and we're going to see it in all parts of culture. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. The one who endures to the end will be saved. So the message is, this is going to be a really tough time. This is really going to be tough. The message here, verse 13, the one who endures to the end will be saved, is not introducing a new means of salvation. It's rather it's a call for faithfulness and endurance during hard times. The one who endures to the end of this will see salvation arrive. Now, those of us who die before all of this happens will miss the whole show, and I'm not sure that that's a bad thing. But endurance to the end will involve a walking by faith, as God told Habakkuk. You just continue walking through it. This photograph, by the way, is yet another kind of lawlessness. This shot was taken in a city in America called Minneapolis during the 2020 riots after the death of a drug addict who died of a fentanyl overdose called George Floyd. And the leftist community decided that this was a good opportunity to loot and burn the community of Minneapolis. Many people were killed in that. Thousands of structures were burned. Stores were looted. There are parts of Minneapolis that will probably never recover. This is just lawlessness. The love of many will grow cold. I think that's clear. How much of that is the tribulation period? Well, we don't know. But when we see things like this happening in America, happening in Europe, happening in other parts of the world, we can know that the end is near. How near? We don't know. But these are definitely the things we're looking forward to observing. So there's some good news that's going on at this time. This is a picture of me the day I took my solo flight in Cessna 172 that's right there behind us. That particular airplane, by the way, crashed several years later, killing an instructor and two private pilot candidates. So I kind of missed that little airplane. That's the one I took my solo in. And these young men with me are two of my instructors who are missionary pilots. And I say that because there is this prediction in verse 14 that the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Okay, the end is always the end of the tribulation and the beginning of the millennial kingdom. So we're looking at something that will happen just before Christ returns. If the church has been taken out at the beginning of the tribulation period, then the preachers of the gospel of the kingdom will be Jewish evangelists, what we might call Messianic Jews, Jews who have come to Christ. The book of Revelation says there will be 144,000 specifically chosen to become believers and then to act as evangelists to the world around them. So that's something that we look forward to. And during that period, during the tribulation period, the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed to the ends of the earth, which means the most difficult places to reach will have some evangelical presence. Our generation is the first generation to have the technology to reach the uttermost parts of the earth. We live in an era where air travel makes it possible to get just about any place you can build an airstrip, or within a couple of miles of any place you can build an airstrip. You can walk. Radio and the internet make it possible to communicate with the world as we are doing right now. The technology simply didn't exist 100 years ago. It couldn't be done. In the same way as Christians in the 12th century were not capable of preaching the gospel in the New World, North and South America. It couldn't be done. The gospel, such as it was carried by Catholics of the time, didn't come to the Philippines until the 16th century. The age of discovery made it possible for the gospel to be carried to the coastlands of the world. Going inland was a big deal. That didn't happen until the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century. So mission boards like China Inland Mission and Africa Inland Mission and South America Inland Mission got away from the coastal cities and into the interior. It's not until the years after World War II that groups like the Mission Aviation Fellowship began trying to reach the unreached people groups who were so difficult to reach that only air travel would make that possible. That's what these little planes are for. Those are designed to get us into places where we've never been able to get. The gospel of the kingdom is the good news that the king is coming, and it will be preached during the tribulation period. We shouldn't confuse the gospel of the kingdom with the gospel of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. That also will be proclaimed, but specifically there is the announcement that the king is at the door, and we need to prepare for this. This King of Kings who died for our sins is now about to set foot on the earth and establish a kingdom that will last 1,000 years. So it's a slightly different thing. And we have to be careful to keep things in context. So gospel of the kingdom proclaimed to the world as a testimony to the nations, then the end will come. And not until then. So we're actually at a place where we could make it happen. So verse 15. Now this is just about where we need to knock it off today, but let's look at this slide. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So let's talk about that. The abomination of desolation, we'll remember, is described in the book of Daniel. This is the description here is of something terrible that Antiochus Epiphanes did in about 167 BC that kicked off the Maccabean revolt. Okay, so that's a historical thing. Antiochus, the evil character of the Seleucid Empire, erected a statue of Zeus and made sacrifices to the statue of Zeus in Jerusalem, in the temple. That is the abomination of desolation. Daniel also says that at the midpoint of the tribulation period of the 7-year 70th week, the Antichrist will break his covenant with the people of Israel and will establish an abomination of desolation in the holy place. The holy place is the Holy of Holies of the Jerusalem temple. This assumes, remember that this is being written 200 years after the original abomination of desolation. So Jesus is not speaking of the Antiochus Epiphanes. He's speaking of this middle of the tribulation event. This seems to be the breaking point where the Antichrist breaks his covenant with the Jewish people, breaks the peace, desecrates the temple, which assumes a temple in Jerusalem. Prophecy scholars speak of this as the tribulation temple. The book of Ezekiel describes a temple that will exist in Jerusalem during the millennial kingdom. As a great big temple. It's really going to be spectacular, and the whole earth will come. People from all over the world will come to Jerusalem to learn from Jesus himself, to ask him for things, to inquire of him. And that temple is not the tribulation temple. The tribulation temple seems to be a temporary thing. What we have today is actually several groups, but the most notable group in Jerusalem is called the Temple Mount Faithful. Temple Mount Faithful has been raising money and making plans. They've constructed furniture for the temple, including a menorah, a table of showbread, an altar of incense, some other bits and pieces, clothing for a high priest. They've reestablished the ashes of a red heifer, so the cleansing of a temple can be done. Some have said that prefab panels for the temple have been constructed and are in storage. I'm not sure that that's true. I've been to the Temple Mount Faithful Museum near the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where models of the articles of the temple are located. So it's interesting to see if they'll be able to raise enough money to do everything that they anticipate doing. But the fact that such a group exists and that they are making this sort of plans indicates their hope that a peace agreement can one day be reached with the Arab powers who hate them, to allow the rebuilding of at least a semblance of the temple. It is that tribulation temple that will be desecrated by the abomination of desolation. There is no other literal way of understanding this passage. But when that happens, all kinds of bad things are going to happen. That marks the beginning of the great tribulation, or what the Old Testament calls the day of Jacob's trouble. This is more trouble than Jacob has ever had before. This is really, really bad. So this passage by itself presumes that there will be an Israel in the land, a people of Israel in the land, with a temple in Jerusalem that, among other things, assumes a re-establishment of a Jewish nation. The existence of a Jewish nation and of Israel is assumed by the prophetic literature, by the texts. And those of us who support the existence and pray for the peace of and Israeli Jerusalem are today a minority within Christendom. Most Christians, Roman Catholics, and the mainstream of Protestants believe that Israel has been replaced by the church, and there is not now and can never be a legitimate Israeli state. And they're part of the anti-Semitic haters of modern Israel. And I run into them all the time. In interactions on the internet, these people are happy to argue that Israel has no legitimacy and should not exist as a state, that we ought to support the aspirations of Hamas, these rapers and murderers. We ought to rejoice when things like this this oil painting take place. If Israel could be wiped off the map entirely, these anti-Semitic haters would be exultant. Now, I consider that a heretical viewpoint. I think that's really wrong. We're going to stop here. It's just about halfway through chapter 24. I'm going to finish up next week. Will be the easy way to do this. And after that, I believe we're going to go straight on into the book of Revelation. So about one more week in Matthew 24, and then we'll take a look at the book of Revelation. Let me kill this. See if I can make the share stop. Okay, let's see everybody. Oh, look at everybody. Good crowd. See Roger there. Yeah. Okay. Good. Let me ask everybody to unmute. There we go. Yeah, we can say bye-bye. I'll see you again next week. I really love you guys. It's a gigantic encouragement to just show up here and have Deborah in the background hollering. Love you all. Take care there in Italy or the Philippines. Keep us informed of how you're doing. Okay. Bye now. Love y'all. Bye.
Bye.
Ciao,
Thank
Joel.
you.
Bye, June.
Thank you.
And yeah, Roger, bye. Christy, bye.